"They can break my bones before they sell me to a brothel," the fat woman shouted. "I'd rather die standing than live like that." Her voice cut through the cold November air like a whip. The auction yard on the Wyoming frontier should have been just another Saturday scene. Wagons lined up, men spitting tobacco, dust and horse sweat hanging low over the pens. Instead, the crowd had gone almost quiet, drawn toward the rough wooden platform behind the livery where special stock was being sold. 5 women stood there in shackles. The one who'd shouted drew every eye. Ruth Callahan, about 30 years old, easily 350 pounds, towered over the others. Her auburn hair had escaped its bonnet and tangled around a bruised face. Her dress was torn under the arms and tight across her belly and hips, making her look even larger. Her wrists were raw, where iron met flesh. But it was her eyes that made people stare, angry, green, and absolutely unbroken. The auctioneer, a weasel-faced man with tobacco-stained teeth, grinned at the crowd as though this were a pleasant joke. "Lot number 4, he called, gesturing toward Ruth. "Healthy female, strong back, big bones. Good for field labor, or any other kind of labor you gentlemen might have in mind." Laughter rolled across the yard. A few men whistled. Someone shouted something filthy about how much use a big woman could provide if you knew how to handle her. Ruth straightened, breathing hard, cheeks burning with humiliation but refusing to drop her gaze. "I'm a free woman," she snapped. "You've no right to sell me. I'll not warm the beds of any man here." One of the guards moved fast. The backhand cracked across her face so hard the crowd heard it. She rocked sideways, stumbled, almost went to her knees. But she did not fall. Blood slid from the corner of her mouth. Her lip trembled, but her chin lifted again. "Still got spirit," someone snickered. "They'll beat that out of her soon enough." The auctioneer lifted his hands for silence. "Who'll start the bidding at $20 for lot 4? Strong as any mule, gentlemen. A bit of extra meat never hurt nobody." If you were standing in that yard today watching this, what would you do? And if you're listening to this story right now, where in the world are you hearing it from? Tell me in the comments, because stories like this one travel farther than any wagon. 20! called a man from the back, owner of the roughest saloon in town. 30, the brothel madam in purple silk added lazily. "She'll earn it back in a week." The auctioneer's grin widened. $30 for the fat one. Do I hear 35? The crowd shifted, hungry and curious. And then a new voice rolled over them, deep, cold, and carrying the kind of authority that made men move aside without thinking. $50, the mountain man said, stepping out of the dust and into the light. Gideon Frost didn't look like a man who belonged in a town. He stood a full head taller than most around him, broad as a barn door, wrapped in a heavy buffalo coat that had seen more winters than some of the boys staring at him now. His beard was thick, streaked with early gray, and his eyes carried the cold weight of a man who'd lived too long in the mountains and trusted too little in human kindness. But when he looked at Ruth Callahan, something in his expression shifted, something sharp and dangerous. The auctioneer cleared his throat nervously. Gideon Frost was not the sort of man whose presence one ignored. $50 then. Excellent starting. 75, Gideon said without blinking. A murmur rippled through the gathering. Ruth stiffened. She didn't know this man didn't trust him, but something about the steady way he stood, calm, grounded, unflinching, felt different from the others who'd ogled her like cattle. The brothel madam raised her hand, annoyed. 80. 100, Gideon replied instantly, his voice flat as a hammer strike. The crowd collectively inhaled. $100 was near half a year's wages for a working man. For a large widow labeled difficult, it was unheard of. Ruth stared at him, confused, wary, but undeniably alive with new fear. Why? Why would a stranger pay so much for a woman like me? Every cruel word ever spoken about her body tugged at her confidence. Because men like big women for one thing, and one thing only, the harsh voice of her past whispered. But the brothel madam wasn't done yet. 120, she called with a venomous glare. Gideon's hand dropped to his hip. He didn't draw. He didn't have to. 200. Silence fell, solid, heavy, absolute. The madam turned away, lips pressed tight. No one bid again. Sold! The auctioneer barked quickly, as though afraid Gideon might think twice. Lot 4 goes to Mr. Gideon Frost for $200. As the iron keys rattled and the guard fumbled with Ruth's shackles, Gideon stepped onto the platform. His voice dropped low, steady. You able to walk, ma'am? Ruth hesitated, rubbing her raw wrists. What do you want with me? To get you off this gallows, he said simply. Can you walk? She tested her legs, wobbly, weak, but she nodded. He wrapped a steadying hand near her elbow, close enough to catch her if she fell, far enough not to presume. For a man his size, the careful gentleness was startling. He guided her off the platform, through the crowd, and toward his horse waiting by the hitch rail. Behind them, whispers rose. Mountain man's gone mad, paying that much for her. He'll work her to death up in those hills. No, look how he steadies her. Ain't no cruelty in that hand. Ruth heard every word, each one biting, but nothing stung more than her own uncertainty. Tell me the truth, she said quietly as they reached his horse. Are you planning to use me the way the madam wanted to? Gideon stopped, really looking at her then. His gray eyes were steady, unreadable. No, he said. I didn't buy you for your body. I bought you because nobody else in that yard was going to save you. Ruth swallowed hard. Her throat tightened with disbelief, and something she refused to call hope. If you're lying, I don't lie, he said simply, and something about the way he said it made her believe him. He lifted her with effortless strength onto his mare's back, then mounted behind her with the practiced ease of a man who lived half his life in the saddle. Where are you taking me? She asked as the horse began to move. Someplace safer than this? Ruth closed her eyes for a moment, letting the cold wind cool the burning humiliation on her cheeks. My name's Ruth Callahan. Gideon Frost, he replied. She let out a bitter laugh. I suppose I owe you thanks. No, he said, not yet. You'll see why soon enough. She didn't like the sound of that. Tell me, she insisted, why was I on that platform in the first place? They said my husband owed money. He never did. He kept his accounts clean. He was an honest man. You married? Gideon asked. Was, Ruth corrected softly. He died last spring. Gideon didn't speak. He waited. They came 2 days after the funeral, Ruth said, voice trembling. Said he'd borrowed against our land claim. Said if I couldn't pay, they'd take the property and me both. I told them they were lying. They beat me for it. The wind felt colder. I ran, she continued. They caught me, shackled me, sold me like a mule. Gideon's hands tightened on the reins. She didn't see his jaw clench, but she felt the horse shift beneath them as his rage simmered. They weren't collectors, he said finally. They were slavers. Legal on paper or not, slavers all the same. Ruth drew a shaky breath. And you? What are you? Someone who's seen too many women destroyed by men like that. He nudged the mare into a steady trot toward the open prairie. And someone who won't let it happen again. The prairie stretched endless before them, a rough golden sea rolling beneath the November sky. The wind cut sharp at Ruth's cheeks, but compared to the cold iron of shackles and the stench of the slavers' camp, this was freedom, raw and terrifying. Gideon rode with the steadiness of a man who knew the land the way most men knew their own hands. He didn't crowd her, didn't force conversation, didn't touch her beyond what was necessary to steady her in the saddle. But his presence behind her, solid, unshakable, felt like a wall against the world she'd just escaped. After nearly an hour, Ruth finally broke the silence. "You never told me where you're taking me." Gideon's voice came low, carried by the wind. "My cabin, 3 days north." "A cabin?" she echoed. "Up there? Alone with you?" He didn't bristle, didn't take offense. He simply answered, "If that worries you, I'll leave you in the next town we pass, with money to start over." She blinked. "Why would you do that?" "Because I didn't buy you," he said. "I freed you. What you do with that freedom is your choice." Ruth wasn't used to choices, not in months. The slavers had taken far more from her than her home. They'd taken her certainty, her dignity, and left behind a brittle kind of shame. "What about you?" she asked softly. "Why bring me to your place at all?" Gideon exhaled through his nose, slow and weighty. "Because winter's coming sharp, and because a man gets tired of listening to his own breathing. I could use another pair of hands on the homestead. You need a place to land. Maybe we help each other." It wasn't romance. It wasn't pity. It was something sturdier, practicality laced with a hint of hope. Ruth cleared her throat. "If I come with you, what exactly do you expect?" Gideon's answer was immediate. "Work, partnership, a fair share of what we make." No innuendo, no insinuation, just the plain dealings of a man who'd long ago traded society for solitude. But even so, Ruth's old fears whispered in her ear. "And what if I can't do what you need?" "Then I'll set you up in town once the roads thaw come spring." He shrugged. "You won't owe me a thing." Ruth stared at the horizon so he wouldn't see her face twist with unexpected emotion. No man had ever spoken to her like that. Not her husband. Sweet as he'd been, he'd treated her delicately, as though she might break. Not the slavers, who'd treated her like property. But Gideon? He treated her like a worker, a survivor, a person. They rode until the sun slanted low, then made camp beside a creek that burbled faintly beneath a thin glaze of ice. Ruth slid off the horse, her muscles trembling from weakness and the long days in chains. She stumbled, and Gideon was there instantly, steadying her elbow, not grabbing, not dominating, catching her. "You're exhausted," he said. "Sit by the fire. I'll handle camp." Ruth bristled. "I can work." "I don't doubt that," he said, voice firm. "But you need food and rest first. You push past exhaustion, you collapse, and I ain't carrying a grown woman 3 days through snow if I can help it." It should have embarrassed her. It didn't. It felt like a truth spoken without malice. She lowered herself onto a fallen log, while Gideon struck flint to steel. Within minutes, flames sparked to life, and heat spread through the air. He tossed her a blanket from his pack. "Wrap up. Temperature drops fast out here." Ruth pulled it around her shoulders, inhaling the faint scent of pine and wood smoke clinging to the wool. "Tell me something," Gideon said suddenly as he poured beans into a tin pot. "What makes you think you're not strong enough?" Ruth froze. "I never said that." "You didn't have to. It's written all over you. Every time I say work or mountains, your eyes flick away like you're expecting someone to tell you you can't." Ruth's cheeks burned. "My husband, he never said I wasn't strong, but he didn't like me doing heavy work, said it wasn't proper." "And the slavers?" "They beat me when I slowed down," she whispered, "when I talked back, when I—" "Those men were cowards?" Gideon stirred the pot with a stick. "Cowards beat people they fear. They saw you had fight in you, wanted to crush it." Ruth hugged the blanket tighter, the warmth seeping into her bones. "What makes you so sure I'm strong?" Gideon looked at her then, really looked, eyes flinty in the firelight. "Because you're sitting upright after days in chains. Because you fought back on that platform. Because you rode 30 miles on an empty stomach and didn't complain once. Weak people don't do that." Ruth stared into the flames. For months she had felt like a burden, like a failure, like someone only valuable as long as she bent her neck and took what the world shoved at her. But Gideon Frost spoke of her like she was something else entirely. Supper was simple: beans, hardtack softened in the broth, and a sliver of salt pork. But Ruth couldn't remember the last time she'd tasted food without choking on fear. As darkness settled, Gideon spread his bedroll on the opposite side of the fire. "You take the warm side. Your body's been through hell. You need the heat." Ruth swallowed. "Aren't you cold?" "I've lived through worse." He lay back, folding his arms beneath his head. "Get some sleep, Ruth. We ride early." For the first time in months, she closed her eyes without dread. But sleep didn't come quickly, not because of fear, because for the first time since her life had shattered, she could feel the faint pulse of something daring and dangerous. Hope. The Absaroka Range rose like jagged teeth against the winter sky on the morning Ruth first saw Gideon's cabin. 3 days of hard riding had carved aches into her bones, but the sight before her stole the breath from her lungs. A sturdy log home with smoke curling from the chimney, a small barn, a woodshed stacked high, and a frozen creek glinting between snow-covered pines. It wasn't grand, it wasn't pretty, but it looked safe. She hadn't felt safe in months. Gideon helped her down from the horse, his hand steady but never lingering. "Welcome," he said simply. "Get inside. It's warm." Warm was an understatement. When Ruth stepped over the threshold, heat enveloped her like a thick wool coat. A great stone hearth dominated the main room, its fire roaring to life. Heavy beams crossed the ceiling, and the wide plank floor bore the scuffs of years of work. On one wall hung tools, axes, knives, snares, each sharpened and meticulously arranged. On another, shelves lined with jars held dried berries, beans, smoked meat, and roots. And in the corner stood something she didn't expect: a small table with a half-carved wooden figure resting beside curled wood shavings. A bird, she realized, rough yet delicate, feathers hinted in smooth strokes. Gideon's voice followed her inside. "That room there's yours." A modest bedroom waited beyond the doorway. A straw-filled mattress, a thick quilt, a small dresser, a single window, looking toward the creek. "Why give me the good room?" she asked, confused. Gideon shrugged out of his coat and hung it by the fire. "You're the one healing. I sleep in the loft. Always have." He didn't give her time to argue. Instead, he lifted the heavy pot from the hearth. "Sit. You need a proper meal." Ruth sat at the table, watching as Gideon filled 2 bowls with thick rabbit stew, steam rising fragrant with onions, sage, and the earthy smell of root vegetables. He set a bowl in front of her, then paused. "You eat first." Ruth blinked. "What?" "Eat," he repeated softer. "Your body needs it more than mine." No man had ever said such a thing to her. Her husband, gentle though he'd been, had always claimed she needed less food than him despite her size. The slavers had tossed scraps her way like she was a stray dog. Gideon sat only when she'd taken her first bite, and the stew was rich enough to make tears sting her eyes. She hadn't cried in front of anyone in years, but the warmth of the fire, the solidity of the cabin, and this man's quiet care chipped at something inside her she'd held together with nothing but sheer stubborn will. "You all right?" he asked, noticing the way she blinked too quickly. "Yes," she said. "It's just been a long time since someone fed me without expecting something in return." Gideon didn't say anything. He just ate, slow and methodical, as though allowing her silence to settle without judgment. After supper, he stood. "I'll show you the cabin tomorrow. Tonight, rest. There's water warming if you want to wash up." Her throat tightened again. A hot wash? For her? After months of filth and humiliation? "Thank you," she whispered. Gideon tilted his head, studying her with those steady gray eyes. "Ain't nothing to thank me for. You're my partner now. Partners take care of each other." She went to her room and washed, watching weeks of dirt and fear swirl away in the basin. When she emerged in the clean shirt Gideon had loaned her, she found him still at the hearth, carving quietly. Wood chips gathered around his boots. "Can't sleep yet," he explained without looking at her. "Mine's too loud." "What are you carving tonight?" she asked. "Bear." He paused, then added, "I can make you something if you want." She hesitated. "Why do you make them?" Gideon's knife paused mid-stroke. His voice came quiet, roughened by something old. "Gives my hand something to do when thinking gets too heavy." Ruth felt that truth in her bones. She slept deeply that night for the first time since her husband died. The next morning, work began. Gideon bundled her into a warm coat and boots he'd kept from a trading post haul. "They'll be big on you, but better than freezing." When she tried to protest, she wasn't used to taking things. He cut her off. "You're here now. You need proper clothes if you mean to live." Outside, the cold bit hard, but the sun was bright on the snow. "All right," Gideon said, handing her a rope. "First lesson, wood gathering." She braced herself for humiliation, her size, her lack of stamina. But Gideon never rushed her, never barked orders, never scoffed when she struggled. He showed her how to spot dry logs beneath the snow, how to test their soundness, how to swing an axe safely. "Here," he said when she raised the axe awkwardly, "your stance is off." He stepped behind her, but didn't touch her. Instead, he corrected his own posture beside hers, demonstrating with his body rather than forcing her into position. "See? Feet wide, knees soft, back straight." Ruth mirrored him, feeling her muscles adjust, her center steady. "Try again." The axe bit clean through the log. Pride flickered through her chest like a spark leaping from the hearth. "Good," Gideon said simply, not exaggerated praise, not condescension, just acknowledgement. They spent the day checking the smokehouse, hauling wood, gathering the last vegetables from the root cellar and repairing a loose hinge on the barn door. Gideon taught with patience, and Ruth learned eagerly, grateful for the burn in her muscles, a sign she was becoming something stronger than a victim. In the afternoon, they paused by the creek. Snow dusted the banks, and the water beneath the ice hummed soft and steady. Ruth exhaled, breath clouding the air. I forgot what quiet felt like. Gideon's voice was low. Town noise ain't natural. This is. They walked back to the cabin together, their steps falling into an easy rhythm. Inside, the fire crackled, filling the room with warmth. That evening, as Ruth mended one of Gideon's shirts and he carved at the table, something subtle but undeniable shifted. Their silences became companionable. Their glances lingered a little too long. Hope rooted deeper, and for the first time since losing everything, Ruth dared to imagine a life where her strength mattered, where she wasn't too much or too little, just enough. Gideon glanced at her then, his voice almost tentative. You did good today. She smiled, soft and real. Thanks to your teaching. He shook his head. No, thanks to your grit. Ruth looked into the fire, feeling warmth that had nothing to do with the flames. She was healing, and she wasn't doing it alone. Winter closed around the cabin as December deepened, settling thick and silent across the mountains. For a time, the world felt reduced to the soft hiss of falling snow, the smell of stew simmering on the hearth, and the steady rhythm of work shared between two people learning the contours of each other's presence. But winter also had a way of unearthing things buried deep. It began with the nightmares. Ruth woke 3 nights in a row with her breath caught in her throat and her hands fisted in the quilt. Shackles, whips, the madam's cold voice telling her how men liked women with meat. She sat rigid in the dark, heart pounding, staring toward the living room where Gideon kept the fire burning through the night. The 3rd night, Gideon came down from the loft when he heard her door creak. You all right? He asked quietly. No judgment, no intrusion, just steady, grounded concern. Ruth swallowed. It's nothing. He didn't push. He simply nodded, added another log to the fire, and sat beside it, carving in silence until her breathing steadied. She watched him from the doorway, struck by how his presence calmed her without him saying a word. But her past wasn't done clawing at her. 2 days later, while checking the trap lines with Gideon, they found tracks in the snow, 3 horses headed north. Gideon crouched, touching the prints, his jaw hardened. Not locals, he murmured. Too deep, too heavy. Armed men, likely. Ruth's heart lurched. Could they be? Yes, Gideon said, standing slowly. Could be the slavers tracking what they think is stolen property. She wrapped her arms around herself. They wouldn't come this far. Men like that will cross hell to reclaim profit, Gideon said, but they won't find us easy. He lifted his gaze to hers, steady as ever. You're safe with me. She believed him, but fear sat heavy in her chest all the same. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Ruth finally asked the question burning in her throat. Gideon, if they come here, if they demand I go back, what will you do? Gideon didn't answer immediately. He set down his carving. The half-finished wooden bear cast a small shadow across the table. I buried my sister because men like that destroyed her, he said quietly. I won't bury you. Ruth's breath hitched. The fierce promise shook something loose inside her, something she'd kept locked behind walls, since the slavers first dragged her from her home. But Gideon wasn't a man without ghosts. That night, after Ruth had gone to bed, she heard him in the living room, boots pacing, boards creaking. At first, she ignored it, but then she heard something she'd never heard from him before, a choked sound, pained, raw. She opened her door softly. Gideon stood by the mantel, one hand braced against it, shoulders shaking. The firelight revealed a man stripped of his unshakable composure, his grief laid bare. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Gideon?" He stiffened, immediately trying to pull himself back together, but Ruth crossed the room and touched his arm before he could retreat behind silence. "You don't have to hide from me," she said. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then, in a voice as rough as split timber, he said, "I couldn't save her." "Your sister," Ruth said gently. Gideon nodded, eyes fixed on the fire. "Lizzie was 16. Sweet, too trusting for a world like this. When our parents died, a man offered to take her in. Said he'd give her housework. Instead, he took her to Denver." Ruth felt her stomach twist. "It took me 2 years to track her down," Gideon continued. "I got there 1 week too late. She'd hanged herself." Ruth pressed a hand to her mouth. He exhaled shakily, as though the memory cut fresh every time. "I killed the man who took her, killed every handler in that place, spent years hunting others like them. But by the time my vengeance burned out, I had nothing left but these mountains." He looked at her then, eyes raw. "And when I saw you on that platform, same look in your eyes Lizzie had before she lost hope. I knew if I walked away, I'd damn myself again." Ruth placed her hands gently on his forearm, grounding him. "You didn't walk away. You saved me." His voice was quiet. "I don't want saving to be the only thing I'm good for." She understood that more than he knew. "Gideon," she said softly, "you've given me more than rescue. You've given me work, dignity, purpose. You've treated me like a whole person when others treated me like livestock. Don't diminish that." A muscle in his jaw worked. "It's not enough if I can't keep you safe." "You already have," she whispered. Their eyes held, firelight flickering between them, something unspoken tightening the space like a drawn bowstring. Then a loud crack split the night, something outside stepping on ice. Gideon's entire body tensed. In one fluid motion he grabbed his rifle from beside the door. "Stay behind me," he said, the softness gone, replaced by lethal focus. Ruth's pulse hammered. Footsteps, voices, 3 men. "We tracked her north," one voice growled. "Place is up ahead." Ruth's breath froze in her chest. "They found me." Gideon positioned himself at the window's edge, eyes cold steel. "You trust me, Ruth?" "Yes," she whispered without hesitation. "Then listen close," he said. "No matter what you hear, you stay inside unless I call for you." Ruth clutched the edge of the table, trembling. "Gideon!" He glanced back at her, and what she saw wasn't fury or fear. It was promise. "They won't take you, not while I'm breathing." He stepped outside into the falling snow, the rifle's shadow long against the white ground. Ruth watched from the doorway crack, heart pounding, as the 3 slavers emerged from the trees. "Frost," one spat. "We know you got her. Hand over the woman." Gideon's reply was low, deadly. "No." "This ain't personal," the man snarled. "She's property, owed money." "She owes you nothing," Gideon said. "Now leave." "Or what?" the leader sneered, stepping closer. The mountain man lifted his rifle. "Or you'll learn real fast what becomes of slavers in my mountains." The wind howled through the pines. Snow swirled between the figures like stirred ash. The standoff crackled with danger. Ruth gripped the doorframe so tightly her knuckles went white. For the first time in months, fear wasn't her deepest feeling. It was fury. And it was the beginning of something stronger than fear, an awakening. Ruth Callahan was done running, done hiding, done being owned, and she would not let Gideon face this alone. The snow muffled every sound except the low, taut voices of the men outside. Ruth watched through the narrow gap in the doorway, her breath fogging in the frigid air. 3 slavers stood at the edge of Gideon's yard, their horses snorting steam behind them. The men looked smaller than she remembered, less monstrous, more like what they truly were, cowards who preyed on the unprotected. But Gideon Frost was not unprotected, and neither was she anymore. Gideon stood between them and the cabin, rifle steady in his hands. His size alone would have intimidated most men, but it was the stillness in him that made the slavers hesitate. He wasn't shaking, he wasn't shouting, he was simply waiting, silent as a loaded trap. "I'll say it one last time," the leader barked. "Hand over the woman. Her husband owed us, and we own her until that debt is paid." "You don't own people," Gideon said, voice calm as winter stone. "That ain't for you to decide." Gideon lifted the barrel slightly. "It is today." The second man stepped forward, spitting into the snow. "You think you can just buy her at auction and claim she's yours? She's ours. She's worth good money. We're taking her." A cold fury swept through Ruth. Worth money. Worth property. Meat. She felt something inside her break, and something stronger rise in its place. Gideon shifted his stance, positioning himself directly between the cabin door and the men. "You boys ride away now," he said, "and you get to keep breathing. Stay. And this ends the way slaver stories always end in these mountains. With graves the wolves dig up come spring." The leader barked a laugh. "You ain't killing nobody. You're just one man." "Wrong," Gideon replied. "There are 2 of us here." Ruth's heart slammed against her ribs. He meant her. He believed in her strength. But he didn't know yet just how much she intended to prove him right. The leader spat a curse, signaling his men, hand on his holster. Gideon saw it. Ruth saw it. The world held its breath. And then Ruth stepped out into the snow. Gideon's head snapped toward her. "Ruth!" "No," she said, voice steady. "This is my fight, too." She stepped to his side, shoulders squared, face lifted to the slavers who'd starved her, bruised her, stripped her dignity. "You don't own me," she said, voice ringing across the frozen yard. "You never did, and you won't touch me again." The men stared, surprised, maybe even unsettled, by the fury blazing in her green eyes. "You got some nerve," the second man sneered, "talking like you matter." Ruth's voice sharpened. "I matter enough that you came across 3 counties to reclaim me." Gideon's hand twitched, not to pull her back, but to steady himself. Her courage hit him harder than any blow. The leader growled, "I'm done with this. Grab her." He reached for his gun. Gideon moved first. One shot cracked through the frozen air, clean, precise, aimed into the snow at the man's feet. A warning. "Next one goes through your knee," Gideon said. "Third one goes through your skull." The slavers hesitated, shaken, but the leader wasn't smart enough to stop. He raised his revolver. Ruth didn't think. She acted. Grabbing the iron poker from beside the porch steps, she hurled it with all the strength of a woman who had survived humiliation, starvation, captivity, and refused to be powerless again. It struck the leader's gun hand with a sickening crack. The revolver flew into the snow. He howled in pain. Gideon fired again, this time into the dirt by the second man's boot. "Mount your horses," he commanded. The men scrambled back, cursing, clutching their weapons and licking their wounds. "You'll pay for this," the leader shouted as they mounted. "You're harboring stolen property." Gideon stepped forward, towering, unyielding. "Come back here again," he said coldly, "and I'll put you in the ground. That's not a threat. It's a promise." The slavers fled into the trees, their retreat swallowed by snowfall and distance. Silence settled. Ruth exhaled shakily, not realizing she'd been holding her breath. Gideon turned to her slowly, eyes fierce, not with anger, but with something deeper. Admiration, pride, something warm and stunning that made her chest tighten. "You shouldn't have come out," he said softly. "Yes," Ruth replied, breathless. "I should have." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're stronger than any 3 men I've ever met," he said finally. Ruth stepped closer. "I survived them. I survived loss. I survived what they tried to make me. Gideon, standing beside you wasn't courage. It was the first time I felt like myself again." Something inside him shifted. She could see it in his eyes. And before she could think or doubt or fear, he reached for her hand, lifting it gently, as though it were the most precious thing he'd ever touched. "You're safe here," he murmured. The words trembled through her like warmth. The snow kept falling. The slavers were gone. But the storm inside both of them had only just begun to break. The cabin felt different that evening, as though some invisible line had been crossed out in the snow when Ruth stepped forward beside Gideon, refusing to hide behind him. The fire burned low, crackling softly, while the storm outside pressed against the walls like a restless animal. But inside, warmth pooled in every corner. Gideon had hardly spoken since the confrontation, not out of anger. She could feel that. No, he was thinking, sorting through something heavy and wordless. He had always been a man of silence, but tonight the quiet was charged, humming, alive. Ruth sat at the table mending a tear in her sleeve. Her hands were steady, but her heart was a wild thing in her chest. She kept replaying the moment she'd hurled the poker, the sound of Gideon's warning shots, the look in his eyes when she stepped out beside him, not behind him, beside him. He finally broke the silence. "You scared me today." She looked up sharply. Gideon Frost was not a man who scared easily. "I didn't mean to." "I know." He rubbed the back of his neck, gaze fixed on the fire. "But when you walked out, Ruth, those men would have killed you without a second thought." "And they would have killed you too," she countered gently. He huffed a breath. "Difference is, I'm built for killing. You're built for surviving." Ruth shook her head. "You think survival is gentle? Gideon, surviving is the hardest thing a person can do. It's not soft. It's not easy. It's strength, the kind that doesn't show in muscle." He finally met her eyes. What she saw there made her breath catch. Raw admiration, threaded with something softer, something dangerously close to longing. "You stood with me," he said quietly. "No one stood with me in 20 years." Ruth folded her mending and placed it aside. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You stood with me first." The firelight flickered across Gideon's face, softening his harsh lines. He took a step toward her, then another. She didn't move, didn't breathe, afraid a single motion might shatter the fragile pull drawing them together. When he stopped in front of her, He was close enough that she could feel the heat of him warming her skin. Slow, careful, as though asking permission with every inch, he reached out and tucked a loose curl behind her ear. His touch was feather-light, but it felt like a vow. "I meant what I said earlier," Gideon murmured. "You're safe here. As long as I'm breathing, no one will ever hurt you again." Ruth swallowed hard. "And you? Who keeps you safe?" Something flickered in his eyes, a loneliness so old it had turned almost invisible, hidden beneath all that hard-earned strength. "You did," he said. "Today." The words landed between them like a stone in still water, spreading ripples neither of them could ignore. Ruth rose slowly from her chair. The top of her head barely reached his shoulder, but somehow she felt like she met him at full height. "Gideon," she whispered, "what are we doing?" His answer came rough, honest, unguarded. "Trying not to cross a line I've wanted to cross for months." Her breath shook. "And if I want you to?" The air seemed to change, thickening, tightening, warming. Gideon lifted a hand to her cheek, his thumb brushing her skin with reverence. "Then we'll cross it together, slow, careful, only if you're certain." "I am," she breathed. But instead of kissing her, as she expected, as she wanted, Gideon leaned his forehead to hers, closing his eyes like a man praying for steady ground, not claiming, not taking, just holding the moment between them, letting it settle into something deep and sure. "I'm here," he whispered. "So am I," she whispered back. The storm raged outside, wind howling through the trees, but inside the fire glowed steady and quiet, like the beginning of a promise neither needed to speak aloud. Stories like Ruth and Gideon's remind us that strength isn't always loud, and love doesn't always arrive gently. Sometimes it comes in the form of two wounded souls choosing to stand beside each other when the world tries to break them apart. Their fight, their quiet courage, their unexpected tenderness, these are the moments that bind us across time and distance. Wherever you're listening from, whether it's night or morning, whether you're alone or surrounded by family, tell me, where in the world are you hearing this story? And if you still believe love can rise from the harshest winters, stay. The next tale is already on its way.